Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, really excited, and I look forward to discussing my work with you here. So I'd like to actually start with an invitation. We're organizing a conference called Mobile Utopia in November this year. And alongside the conference there is a bonfire school, a summer school, but it's a bonfire school because there's the bonfire on the 5th of November. And also a set of mobile utopia experiments. And what I'd like to draw your attention to especially is those mobile utopia experiments, because I've come to think of my work as my work on mobile work especially as one long mobile utopia experiment. So what are mobile utopia experiments? They are ways of making futures inhabitable enough to experiment with new ways of working, living, thinking, traveling, making relationships, enacting responsibilities, playing, learning, and so on. They could be thought experiments facilitated through narrative or visualization or modeling scenarios. They could also be interactive performances, installations, artworks. And the more hands-on they are, the better, because that invites more than discursive reflection and creativity, allowing embodied social and sensory experimentation. So for our conference, experiments should envisage how people, objects, ideas, resources will be mobile or immobile or immobilized in a near-ish future. So we're thinking about 2051. And these experiments should make pockets of such futures inhabitable as pre-enactments of a utopian everyday. And they should be mobile in two senses. So firstly, they should come at utopia and dystopia, because if you think about utopia, one being's utopia will inevitably be another being's dystopia. So they should come at utopia and dystopia with an analytical orientation to movement, blocked movement and immobility, moorings of people, objects, ideas, information, microbes, data. There are no limits. It could be anything. And secondly, the experiments should move in to the future. They should move with people, and they should use mobile inventive methods. And I'm going to talk you through an example from my work on mobile work in disasters. But that is an experiment that, as I've said, has been going on for years, so we don't expect people to bring experiments like that to the conference. It can be much more ad hoc and improvised things. But it should give you an idea of what our motivation for this conference and these experiments is. Just a couple more preliminaries to put that into context. In Ruth Levitas' words, utopia as method has three modes, which resonate really richly with my mobile methods. The first mode is archaeological, which means carefully unearthing and critiquing social practices and institutions implicit in how futures are envisaged or made. The second is ontological, and in my case that translates into multi-scalar exploration of what it means or could or should mean to be human, or rather more than human. And finally, Levitas' third mode is architectural, a way of making futures, moving into futures, and in my case here today that means making technological and organizational innovation in mobile work. And this is an iterative process, and it's not necessarily sequential in this order. It could start anywhere and cycle round. The Mobile Utopia experiment at our conference also takes advantage of the fact that utopia as method is integrative. It helps us to examine not only pockets of futures, but it also fosters a broader and deeper concern with the good mobile society. How do futures at different scales and in different pockets come together? And of course, the good mobile society today is society beyond societies, as John Ury would have put it. That is, it's society, but in a fluid, liquid, local, national, as well as global and cosmopolitan way, always emergent. Okay, so these are mobile utopia experiments I've done, or am doing, or I am developing. And I'll focus on one particular one today, although some of the others that you see there are related to it, and I might say a bit about them too. And before I get into this, it's important to say that I don't work alone. By its very nature, my work is very collaborative, and while I'm responsible for how I put things here, there are many people involved in the ideas and in the work that we do. And the most important people involved at this particular intersection are listed there. And apart from colleagues at Lancaster University, we've engaged with over 70 practitioners in emergency planning and emergency response from across Europe, and also locally in Lancaster with the Lancashire Resilience Forum, and we're working with the Public Safety Communications Europe Network, some small and medium-sized companies, and lots of researchers in Greece, Germany, Italy. And much of this collaboration is funded by the European Union, especially through the Second Core project. I'm just going to move this out of the way because I keep kicking it. So in the Second Core project, we are interested in this kind of thing. How do emergency responders and emergency planners collaborate and coordinate their work? Their work is often triggered by dramatic movement. It could be literally the earth moving with massively destructive effects, such as in the 3/11 Japan earthquake, tsunami and nuclear incident. Or it could be transport incidents or tragic incidents like this, the Germanwings crash, where a mentally ill co-pilot crashed a plane into the side of a mountain in the French Alps and killed 149 people along with him. And the work of emergency responders is often extremely mobile, as in this case. Just getting up the mountain there took a 45-minute hike, and many of the responders had to be strapped into harnesses to be able to move in this terrain. And the work is also intensely collaborative and distributed, and one of the things that interests us is how do they use infrastructures like communications and computer infrastructures for coordinating their work. So when this picture was taken, over 20 organizations were assisting official emergency agencies and local volunteers in France. From private companies like Lufthansa, Airbus, and insurances like the Alliance, Barcelona and Düsseldorf airports, also the embassies of 18 different countries in Europe, and many international search and rescue teams supported them too, as well as transnational organizations like the Red Cross. And even in a much smaller incident, like a motorway accident, you very quickly have a large number of organizations and stakeholders involved, from official first responder agencies like the fire services, the police, hospitals, and emergency medical organizations, to utilities, telecoms and transport organizations, volunteer organizations, commercial operators like supermarkets or hotels, schools, public organizations, but also the public themselves, and of course the media. So how do they communicate, share information? How do they record evidence they find in databases? We're interested in the infrastructures they use, but also in how they actively infrastructure as a verb. how do they do that to support their coordination? And radios, mobile phones, spreadsheets actually are absolutely critical, as are whiteboards. But these are also are you okay? Yeah, okay. So these are also increasingly combined with, or sometimes meant to actually replaced by digital infrastructures. So we're interested in all of those across the whole cycle of risk analysis, mitigation, response, not just the high adrenaline response phase to disasters. So we're interested in infrastructures, the infrastructuring of learning, risk analysis, mitigation, and community engagement. And we're prompted to do this research by a range of things, including insights from interviews and observations, literature reviews, as well as the potential or perceived potential of new technologies. And this is from an interview that I did with a police officer in Oslo who reflects on his involvement in the 2011 Norway attacks. And he says that when he gets to the scene, when he has to coordinate with his colleagues, everything he does, he has to say it. I have to speak it out on the radio. And I'm not sure that everybody's listening on the radio, so the problem with these big accidents is that you're being so much tied up on your radio. We say in Norwegian, you're getting radioactive. So you use the radio all the time, and then you forget to look, and you forget to hear, and you forget to feel the situation about you. This example also illustrates why you need mobile methods to understand the mobile collaborative work of emergency response. And it also illustrates that mobile methods are not necessarily revolutionarily new, novel methods. Many traditional methods, like ethnographic interviews, are already mobile or can easily be mobilized, for example, by encouraging people to take you into a situation, walk you through what they did, trace for you what information is coming in, going out, and explore with you what's being blocked, such as here, where he's talking about how radioactive communication blocks his sensory perceptions that would normally allow him to feel the situation about him. Now, from the point of view of digital technology developers, there are fairly straightforward solutions to the troubles he describes. If people shared data, like their locations or pictures of the scene that they're seeing, and if they visualize things on maps, then they wouldn't have to talk so much. They could see for themselves. And that's already possible with existing technologies, but it's not happening. So why not? And I'll give you a couple more examples. After the London bombings, people coming out from the underground, like this guy here, were asked for their details, a name, address, next of kin, medical history, over and over and over again. And it caused a lot of distress. People were upset by it. It's recorded in reports. They didn't understand why they had to do this again and again. And the responders didn't share that information because they felt they couldn't. And the official response to this and expert analysis of the events is this. They say it was apparent that in some parts of the emergency response, the requirements of the Data Protection Act were either misinterpreted or overzealously applied. So in an emergency agencies are allowed to share that kind of information because it is in the interest of the public. But they find that these kind of events happen elsewhere, and it's quite a common occurrence in other countries too. And I just let that stand there on its own. This is an example from the Norway attacks in 2011. Just after the bomb went off in Oslo, someone actually called in and said, "I saw what I thought was a policeman, but then I was surprised. He was walking alone and I followed him out of the corner of my eye. He got into a car, a grey van with the following license number." And they actually read out the license number because they'd taken a record of it. And if you remember, the attacker was somebody who disguised themselves in a policeman's uniform. So this is absolutely critical information, and it was recorded on a post-it note, and it was taken into the command center and placed on somebody's desk, marked as really urgent. But it was not discovered for 20 minutes or so, and even then nobody alerted the police patrols to look for this car. And I'm going to play you a clip of what the expert evaluation of the response said to this. It's a bit loud, so prepare yourself, but it's really good to hear it from them themselves.
Could an immediate forwarding of the tip to personnel supplemented with information and contributed to stopping the perpetrator, or is this only speculation? The map shows Bailey's getaway car based on the GPS data from his car and the police owned vehicles. Here you see that Bailey passes a police vehicle close to the American embassy as early as 15.
Oh, the blue ones.
At Police he passes an out-of-town police car at 15:57. And as seen L3, he has just passed the police station at Sandvika. Why was the police not able to deal with the information they had received? And why were measures not implemented in Oslo?
So they're very, very strongly criticizing the police for not acting on what they could have known. They would have been able to access location data and GPS data, and they could have connected it, and they could have known this. So they're being criticized for things that they could have known. And this kind of critique and call for more use of information technology is an absolute siren call for technology developers. And many, including ourselves, are drawn into developing information systems that are meant to provide emergency responders with more information, accessing other information systems and databases. And what these expert evaluation committees and what we are doing here is follow the information and evaluate the roots of information, the effects of its outcome, the learning or the lack of learning or the lack of understanding, with quite different outcomes in terms of the mobile utopia that they envisage. So on the one hand, you have these very critical assessments of what the responders could have known. And here's a place where many such evaluations converge. It's a report by the European Network and Information Security Agency, which gives an absolutely damning assessment of the lack of interoperability and communication problems that are, they argue, costing lives and really badly performing emergency services. And they ask, why are they performing so badly in a world where technology exists that could fix such problems? And many developers jump to that question, including our own team, albeit in a more critical and research-based way. So we did, for example, a comparative review of what technology development is out there to respond to these perceived problems. There's only time for one example, and this is from Japan, what Maeda and his colleagues call a resilient society by information and communication technology systems. And you don't have to take all of this in detail. What's really important to notice is that there are various containers of information that are being connected through the cloud, and the cloud is at the bottom there, that blue cloud. And these containers include public services such as e-government and crisis management, but also private services and data collected for various functions such as mobility, electronic health records, tax, utility, shopping, insurance. And through this infrastructure, it can all be brought together. Now, it's hard not to be moved by the need to find out as quickly as possible whether all those on the record for this Germanwings flight were actually on the flight. To allow relatives to grieve, insurances to pay, and of course to determine the cause of the accident. At the point that we see them here, it was unknown, and there were still thoughts that it could have been a terrorist attack, so they were collecting evidence, and there was still a lot of speculation. And in such a situation, the ability to connect different databases with information, including databases about the pilot's medical records, would be extremely helpful. And there were calls to access any video that might have been taken from inside the plane, and telecoms operators are obliged actually to provide access to their data on people's communications and movements in disaster situations. The question is, of course, and we all know it, do we want to live in a world where such doors between different data stores proliferate like this? And my question is that really the best that technology design and organizational innovation can do? And of course, it's not just the public that are being protected from disasters that are affected by this. There are 20,000 police officers in London with body-worn cameras, and they are asking questions like, do I always have to have it on? Am I to record vulnerable people in potentially difficult situations for them, such as domestic violence? What are the ethical implications of recording people in such situations? Or am I to turn the camera off, or am I supposed to decide whether to turn it on or off? And then if I turn it off, am I making myself liable for people to say, well, you turned it off because you did something wrong? So there are all these really difficult questions. And this is a quote from an emergency paramedic who says that he's afraid of the logging system telling what I did on this or that patient. Because in those logs, we see the patient's vital data, but we don't see how the patient was located, how they were lying, what was around in the room, what influenced what the paramedic was actually capable of doing. So the logs might show a poor treatment of this patient, but it might have been the best treatment that that patient could get in that situation, because the camera doesn't see everything, and the log doesn't see everything. So what's he going to be held accountable on? On his say-so, or is it going to be the log that makes him accountable? Okay, so there are lots and lots of ambiguities. The technologies and new ways of working that are emerging around that create really highly ambiguous ethical, legal, and social issues, opportunities, but also risks, problems, and challenges. This is a diagram that captures some of the key components of the system that we're developing in the second core project. The basic idea of it is that we're developing a Google for disaster-related information that cuts across different data repositories, different languages and different cultural contexts, like Germany and Poland, that we've got as examples up there. And we're actually agnostic over whether the knowledge base down here is something like Myriad et al.'s interconnected public-private corporate databases, which would then make the data content we're searching much, much bigger than the internet, because it would include currently closed data repositories. Or whether it is a dedicated, secure server where people have to consciously upload content that they are happy to share. which would create a lot of extra work. What we are building is what you see on the side here, and you don't need to go into the detail. I'm happy to elaborate on that. But it's a domain ontology and semantics that makes the content searchable in a way that will then bring you disaster risk management relevant information. We're also developing, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, what you see on the right there, which is ethical, legal and social issues guidance. And we're mobilizing utopia as method in this context. So if you're unearthing assumptions about the good, are you with me so far? Yeah. Okay. So if you're, from what I've told you, if you're unearthing assumptions about the good mobile society from amongst the mobilities of data and data analytics in the context of the ideas and visions that I've outlined so far, including our own, what you see, I think quite problematic assumptions about data as a raw material that are simplistically assumed to automatically generate a better understanding of disaster situations. Assumptions that it is okay or even good to have permeable boundaries between agencies to some degree, especially in exceptional situations. And it's assumed that it's easy, or at least possible, to determine when the exception starts and when it ends, and who should decide this. And it assumes that prevention is a good thing. And if you trace the human ontology implied, humans are seen as information processors. There's an assumption that standardization and finding unequivocal definitions is possible and necessary. There's an assumption that people have certain roles and that access to information can be controlled on the basis of these roles. So often it is thought that those highest up need to have the largest ability to get at data, so that they should be allowed to see everything, whereas people lower down should have more restricted access. Now, our work with emergency management practitioners sheds a lot of doubt on all of these assumptions. We quickly found out that data is politics, that there are different interpretations, and it's not easy to decide which ones should become a standard. People have sophisticated practices of configuring awareness and role improvisation. Privacy is a contextual practice and not a quality or property that can be attached to certain kinds of data. People are post-human in the sense that subjectivity is extended by data. We're multiple data subjects in multiple settings. And there are emergent practices of what we're calling radically reflexive resilience, which develops new ways of sensing risk and the systemness of risk through algorithmic augmentation, which could allow us to articulate collective responses through new ways of taking measure of risks and aligning it better with vulnerability, and new ways of acknowledging ignorance and uncertainty beyond blame. So what do we do about it? So we practice what Levitas would call utopia's architecture. We do observations, interviews, focus groups, we sandbox, we experiment with prototypes, which often tells us more about existing practices than the usefulness of the prototype, but it's very, very useful. But most importantly, we work alongside the engineers and the practitioners. And from that, we've come to identify this as something that's really needed to address the difficulties and ambiguities of an increasingly digitally augmented disaster risk management in practice. We need to acknowledge that common information spaces are not simply data oceans with all floodgates opened when exceptions demanded. They need to, it's quite simple really, it's not rocket science at all what we've come up here with, but they need to afford complex socio-technical practices of modulating access flexibly and accountably, where we're actually starting to rethink what access to data might mean, that it is more a practice of sense-making or practices of sense-making, where there's support for trust as a social and material practice and for configuring awareness and diversity of interpretations and contestations. Now, I'd like to zoom in on an example of collaboration in and through motion to explore this. And what we're doing here is a form of contextual transposition, where we're looking at collaboration in detail, in distributed collaboration in a physical space, to understand better what is involved in people's sophisticated social and material practices of trusting, of configuring awareness and interpreting, to then try and transpose those insights into digital contexts. So this is a set of screenshots of video ethnography that I did at a surprise emergency response exercise at Aarhus Harbour in Denmark. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, and the call has just gone out on the emergency radio network. There's a school bus full of teenagers, and it has collided with a chemical goods train at the harbour. And this immediately classifies the accident as a major incident, requiring collaboration between the police, the medical emergency services, and the fire service. So within minutes, the police arrive, and then an ambulance, and it becomes clear that this is an exercise, not a real incident, but the people are very used to exercising and they realize the importance of it. So they go through as realistically as possible what they would do to learn from things like this. So what we can observe here is real professionals practicing collaboration. And the whole thing took 3 or 4 hours, and I'm going to just pick a few moments of this. And the next slide has a video of the first movements of staff arriving, and it's only a few seconds, just a glimpse really. It's very loud, you'll notice, because the first thing they do is turn on a generator so that they can run things. But so that means it's difficult to hear what they're saying, but it's transcribed, so don't be startled. So what you see there in this noisy, seemingly chaotic scene is these ambulance guys need to get to the kids in the bus, they need to get them out. But they also must not put themselves at risk. So with this being a chemical train, they don't know. So the emergency plans stipulate that they can't go into the danger area until the site commander allows them to do that. And the police commander says no when the first paramedic asks, is it safe to go in? And then he asks again and takes a funny kind of sideways step towards the police officer. And this draws the attention of his colleague, who is just putting on a vest to mark him as the ambulance team commander. And it also tells his colleague that there is some trouble, that they can't go straight into the bus. And that kind of embodied conduct is really communicative, but not necessarily meant to be communicative. It's automatically so, in a more social and precognitive way. Here's a similar moment. The ambulance leader walks off from the ambulance, and he sees that a police officer, a guy in the middle there, is looking at something over there. And so he stops too and bends and looks at the same thing. And then a second after he does it, the fireman does it too. So they all go looking at this thing. So you can see a sort of ripple effect or mirroring of certain activities and embodied actions. So clearly something significant is to be seen there. And again, this is communication rolled into movement, rolled into sense-making. And it's based on something that we do very easily in physical spaces. And Schutz calls it reciprocity of perspective, where you know that if you change places with me, you would see what I see, which tells you a lot about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it in the way that I'm doing it. And this can be very carefully modulated. And research in social psychology discovered that this kind of mirroring of postures can be very functional in establishing rapport or trust. And they argue that good rapport, an affinity between people, makes for pleasant relations, but much more than that. It also helps convey professionalism and efficiency to the outside world, the observers of the exercise, for example. But the psychologists don't say very much about how it does that. And this, of course, is critical for us to know if we want to replicate something like this or want to translate something like this into digital environments. So close examination of the practical doing of this mirroring sequence can give us some idea. And I'll show you another example. The firemen have just arrived now, including Mr. Jensen, who's the fire brigade chief officer. And the ambulance leader sees him coming, and he knows him, and he goes towards him and greets him. But he doesn't return the greeting. He's very urgent. He says there's a spill on the other side and keeps walking. And then they actually do this together. And just in the pictures up there, the red ones highlighted there, you see him initiate a retreat. So they look at what they see on the other side, which is there's smoke coming out. And so he initiates a retreat. And part of this becomes a very interesting collaborative gesture in motion. And I'll show you a video of it. Mr. Jensen runs behind the railway carriage, closely followed by the ambulance leader, and they stop and they point and they say, "It is this here?" And the ambulance leader says, "Do we have a CORV, which is a chemical and organic rescue vehicle?" They look, they retreat. And after this sequence, a whole host of decisions are being made. And I got really fascinated by this gesture here. Because while Mr. Jensen goes like this, Jakob goes like this. And this is a very different kind of mirroring. It's not like one looking at something there and then three other people doing the same thing. This is mirroring much more like reflecting. So one goes like this and the other one reflects the gesture like this. So how is this done and why, and what does it do, and how is this part of the decision-making process? So one way to read this is really psychologically, individually and rationally, that Mr. Jensen needs to make a decision whether this is dangerous, and he goes there and he looks at it and he makes a decision over that it is dangerous, and then he decides to protect Jakob from it. But if you look really closely at it, that's not really what's happening, because that protective gesture and the accepting gesture that Jakob makes, they are co-produced. So the first kind of movements have no real meaning. If you look through this carefully, you see that they're actually working this out together. They're doing this reflexively, one picking up very subtle twists and turns in the body and the hand as potentially meaningful, and then they exaggerate, and then it becomes meaningful. And of course it also resonates with what the paramedic asked earlier about the chemical and organic rescue vehicle. So this analysis goes into the minutiae of the movement. And it shows that the mirroring performs a very fast and sensitive, alert attention to each other as much as the environment. Something that reflexively produces a mutual understanding, but also responsibilities and rapport. So if you know that someone is that responsive to your gestures and your reading of a situation, you know that you've got a good thing going. Also interesting here is when the paramedic responds by reflecting the fireman's cupped hand, it becomes meaningful and also does so in a way that is visible from across the incident site. So this broadcasts the interpretation of what's coming out from under the carriage there is dangerous. And just to give you closure on that example, they do decide to get firemen with breathing apparatus to get the kids out of the bus, and then they do that. Okay, so let me give you another more digital glimpse of collaboration in and through motion. As soon as people heard about the Norway attacks, some went online and started to provide often really helpful, practical information. And the Utøya attacks sparked a lot of speculation. People didn't know if it was connected. They were really worried about relatives and friends on the island. And they went online, especially on Twitter. And these activities really supported a heightened situation awareness also for friends and relatives who were desperate to find out about the young people on the island. So if you read this Twitter stream from the bottom upwards, you see that at first people called people on the island. They used their mobile phones, they called them directly, and that was a very bad idea because a phone ringing put them in grave danger. And then this message on the right warns people not to do that because it could alert the shooter to their position. So you get a mediated reflexivity of interaction, a form of configuring awareness and reciprocity of perspective that I think builds on what I showed you in the Aarhus Harbour example. It builds on the knowledge of these kind of embodied practices, and it tries to translate them into the digital environment. Okay, so let me draw things together. A few years back, Donna Haraway echoed Latour's statement, "We have never been modern," by saying, "We have never been human," quite provocatively captured by Stellark here. However, in IT design and elsewhere, we are exceptionally good at denying this, so not accepting that we are like this. In disaster response, this becomes quite consequential. A major reason why the surveillance potential of information technology has risen to the heights that we've seen recently is because technologies are designed to hide their complexity. So we have no idea who's searching us. And it could be otherwise. It doesn't have to be this way. And we're responsible for having made it this way. And the examples of embodied and technologically augmented collaboration that I've shown you open up avenues for different kinds of design. The ways in which people do configuring awareness has sisters in what Thrift talks about as addressability, awareness with an E, co-mobility, connected presence, and many more new post-human phenomenologies, which could be hopeful monsters if we understood them better and supported them better with our technologies. So for us, the question is how to do IT more carefully with mobile methods. And in the past, and with our call for mobile utopia experiments for our November conference, I've been convinced that what we need to do is make futures inhabitable, to experiment with them collectively, socially, materially, to explore and contest and address in embodied ways and material ways what is good and what is not. And I still think that that is critical, but I think we also need to move upstream, and this is a quote from Jack Stilgoe's book, Experiment Earth, which is about geoengineering, where he's calling for this. And by upstream, I mean we need to get engaged before technologies are conceived, before research funding is given out to build them. So at the moment, my work is mostly funded by the EU, who has already decided that making common information space platforms is a good idea. So we get involved in shaping them, but we don't get involved in actually deciding whether that's a good idea or not. And this is one thing that we at the Center for Mobilities Research and the Institute for Social Futures are really focusing our efforts on. And as part of the work that we're doing at the moment, we're formulating ethical, legal, and social issues guidance for designing collaborative IT for disaster risk management. And I can show a bit more about that if you want to. But I'd like to close by pointing out some resonances with other methodological debates in this space, apart from mobilities and mobile methods. And I mentioned already collective experimentation, but particularly important to me are discussions of affirmative critique. And affirmative doesn't mean just affirming the opposite of what you're criticizing. It's a much more constructive, critical endeavor. Or Donna Haraway's call to stay with the trouble, which I think we're definitely doing by getting involved in all these things. Or Latour's call for radically carefully radical design, infrastructuring, and of course, social futures. So I'd be very interested to hear what you think, your questions. Thank you very much.